introduction, and it's a great honor to be here with all those great minds here in the same room. I'm an industry ecologist, as you heard from introduction. So I will talk about carbon footprint, which we also heard a lot today. This is a rather long title, but essentially I want to talk about the carbon footprint and how do we create a technology system that can enable a trustworthy carbon footprint, right? So let me start. Well, I don't think this is my my slide, the updated slides, but if you can switch quickly, that would be great. But if you can, that's fine. So I imagine that you see another slide here, which asks you a question. What is a percentage of household carbon emissions in total carbon emission in China? It sounds like a very simple question. It's a very easy question, straightforward question. But actually it's not so that straightforward. But indeed, it's a very popular question. If you search in Google or Baidu, you will find a lot of numbers, discussions about that percentage. How large is household consumption contribute to the carbon footprint in China, right? I collaborate with Dr. Liu Wei at Luohan Academy. We did some research. First, we found that there are so many different numbers. Most of those numbers are around 50%, 55%, 53%, 52%. It's around 50%. So half of the emissions from China are, according to those sources, are coming from household consumption, right? I see you're shaking your hand. That's right. It's definitely not that large. So I was thinking, we were thinking, really? And we're looking for those sources, and they claim that they cite those numbers coming from some reports, some studies, but actually we cannot find any sources. So we did some research ourselves, try to figure out what exactly is that percentage. When we're talking about carbon emissions, the scope of counting really matters, right? We heard about the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. We heard about a lot of other things, right? It's all about the scope of your accounting, right? So we made a lot of calculations, use most available data we can find and we trust. Eventually we calculate a lot of different percentages based on different scope, counting scope. The largest share we have calculated was 38%, which is about right in the same range with other countries' studies. In Europe, in North America, that percentage is a little bit larger, but for countries like China with a similar consumption structure, similar kind of economic structure, it's in the same range, right? So we think it's a relatively reasonable number, but that 30%, 38%-ish number we calculated was based on the life cycle scope. We essentially divided the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions together for household consumption with the total emission from China, total emission driven by China's consumption. Both the denominator and the numerator are based on life cycle concepts or carbon footprint, essentially. So what is carbon footprint? Randy, you don't need to change the slides. I'm on the right track. So what is carbon footprint? Carbon footprint is based on life cycle thinking. Essentially, we look at the whole process of making a stuff from the raw material extraction to end of life. Right? All right, so this is the slides you're supposed to see earlier, right? But that doesn't matter. Right, so we made a calculation, a lot of different calculations. Some numbers are small, some are larger. Larger ones are all based on life cycle thinking, right? So this is what life cycle thinking is. And carbon footprint essentially means the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the life cycle of a product or technology or a service, right? So life cycle assessment is what we use as a method, as a tool to calculate, to measure carbon footprint of consumption of product or service. Of course, life cycle assessment also measures other types of environmental footprint. Carbon footprint is just one particular category. Right? The carbon footprint for, in terms of the purpose of using carbon footprint for climate mitigation. So first of all, carbon footprint is a counting method, right? It's counting numbers. And a counting method essentially is to allocate the mitigation responsibilities, right? So using carbon footprint or using other sort of similar accounting method is to recognize specific types of mitigation strategies or incentivize those kind of mitigation strategies. So as a result, we use carbon footprint accounting together with other emission counting methods to help to reach the full potential of emission reduction. In another sense, if for a particular product, if the product's carbon footprint is being reduced, that means the supply chain emissions for this product are reduced. Right? If one day that carbon footprint of a product becomes zero, that means the emissions from this whole supply chain of that product becomes zero. And imagine one day the carbon footprint of all the products, all the services we use, we buy, becomes zero. That means we reached carbon neutrality for the whole society, right? So using carbon footprint essentially is to help incentivize the entire society to join efforts to meet the carbon reduction goal. So for many companies, they don't actually directly generate too much emissions. For example, Alibaba, Google, those IT companies, their direct emissions are very limited, right? But if you look at their supply chain, they actually can drive a lot of emissions. So if we only focus on direct emitters, then those companies like Alibaba or Google, they will not be able to participate in a carbon neutrality pursuit. Right? Right. So in China, we already have a lot of national and industry policies that encourage companies to use carbon footprint to help reach more higher emission reduction target. Right. So and currently there are four kinds of I think in my personal opinion there are four categories of applications of carbon footprint in China. First is export restrictions. As we all know, last week the EU's new battery regulation officially became a regulation, and in about 18 months, all the electric vehicle batteries sold on the EU market will have to carry a carbon footprint label, disclosure. And in 54 months, if your carbon footprint is lower than a threshold, you will not be able to sell on the EU market, right? So that's a particular very pressing challenge for especially battery makers in China and also other parts of the world. Second application is supply chain restrictions. A lot of the multinational companies have requests or have pledged to reduce carbon emissions for their supply chain, not only their own emissions. For example, Apple will aim to achieve carbon neutrality for their supply chain by 2030. So as a result, they will push their suppliers to also become carbon neutrality as well. A lot of those suppliers are in China. And the personal carbon count, which very good example is from Alibaba, actually the 88 account, where if you sign up for that account, you spend your money on various Alibaba platforms like Ele.me, we heard earlier. You get, if you choose, the platform will recommend some low carbon options. If you choose the low carbon options, they will calculate a carbon reduction credit for you and accumulate it in your personal account. And if you have enough credit, you can get some discounts for other purchases on their platforms. Right? That number that they calculate is based on the carbon footprint concept. And lastly, there are also marketing purposes. Many companies are trying to disclose their carbon footprint in order to get marketing competitiveness. Right. So what do we need for calculated carbon footprint? Many people, or even many leading companies doing this business, at least in China, are saying that we need so-called emission factors, which is partially true because emission factors like how much kilogram CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions for per unit of product, it's already a result, right? If we have that, my fifth grade daughter can do the calculation, right? In order to get that emission factor, we actually need a lot of other things. So for a very simple product today, we use behind the scenes a very complex industrial system. The figure I show here is a very simple PET bottle. To make a PET bottle, we must have a lot of industrial processes involved. This is just a part of that, right? What we need for calculating carbon footprint is so-called a unit process data. For example, making a PET bottle grade PET granulate, we need what kind of material input, energy input, how much of material export, including emissions. Right? So there are a lot of challenges for those data and also certification. First of all, on data side, we have very incomplete, untransparent, outdated data for China in particular. There are a lot of high quality data from companies, but there are trust issues that prevent them being shared, being used. And there are a lot of databases available, particularly from the EU, Europe. But if we look at those databases, they are being used a lot in a lot of carbon emission, carbon footprint calculations. And some of data are proprietary data. We cannot verify the source. Some data do have a source, but when we look at the actual source, we cannot find that number. Certification. Certification becomes, the core value of certification today, to me, is selling the brand. If I was certified by a big name, you can trust me. Don't need to ask me any questions, right? But it's gradually changing. Last year, the Norwegian Consumer Authority has fined a company that use a third-party certification to claim their products are green, but that certification actually was not done properly, right? So no matter it's a data issue or certification issue, the bottom line is I think is trust. So we need a trustworthy carbon footprint, not only just carbon footprint. Right? We need trustworthy data, trustworthy calculation, trustworthy certification, and the disclosure. So how to address those trust issues? For data owners, we concerned about data breach, leaked, and data used by other people beyond our contract or being reverse engineered to find our secrets. And for the users, we also concerned about a data breach and also quality of data provided by third parties, other people, and what data are available are unknown to data users. So there is technological solution. Data space. Our friends from Europe might be very familiar with this term. It's a very promising technology solution to address data trust issues. And it has been applied in many industries, but has not been in the carbon footprint space, right? So with data space technology, it's not a single technology, it's a technology framework, right? We can create data traceability, authentication, and storage, security, and logging records, all sorts of things that you can think of to help us address those trust issues, right? So essentially, it's like an Alipay for the data in carbon footprint or PayPal, right? Before PayPal or Alipay, we cannot trust the other people that we want to buy stuff from on the internet. But with Alipay or PayPal, that trust issue has been addressed. So similarly, data space here is doing exactly the same thing to address the trust issue for data sharing. So the technology is available. We just need to build application cases. So we are working with International Data Space Association to try to implement this technology framework in the carbon footprint space. Right? So finally, I just want to close with that. First of all, we have data space technology that's available, and we can use that to create a trustworthy carbon footprint ecosystem. and the carbon footprint, trustworthy carbon footprint ecosystem can help us to for climate mitigation and reaching carbon neutrality. So with that, I want to thank you again for the invitation, and thank you very much.